Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of One Room Schoolhouse. Today we are talking about really one of my favorite stories, one of the most successful missionaries in American history, and really the first Black American to successfully evangelize Native Americans, and he did it all when he was like 13 years old. We're talking about John Marrant. And John Marrant is someone that we've talked about at WallBuilders before. If you've seen some of our presentations, you might have heard us tell this story, and I hope you have because it's amazing. If not, you are in for a treat today. John Marrant, incredible young man, and unlike many of the people we've talked about, he was not born into slavery. He was born as a free Black man in one of the New England colonies. So Elijah, walk us through the beginning of his story.
Absolutely. So John Marrant was born in 1755 as a free Black in New York. At the age of 11, he ended up moving to South Carolina and started studying music professionally. By age 13, he was already a professional at playing the violin and the French horn. He talked about in that period of his life, he was in want for nothing. He was so successful at it. He was asked to play at music halls and was making plenty of enough money to be able to support himself. And wow.
Well, hang on. A 13-year-old making so much money, which actually more of the story, he ends up sending money back to his family, but a 13-year-old.
My want list was very long at 13.
Right. I mean, and life was different back then because the reason he moved from New York to South Carolina at that point was he finished school when he was 11 years old in New York, and now it's time for him to get a career. And he finds this music hall and says, I want to play music. And anyway, the story is way more than we're able to give it justification on some level. But the idea that a 13-year-old is making so much money, he's like, anything I could have, anything I wanted, I could have had. That's a crazy thought. And yet, this was how good he was as a musician, how proficient he was. When you have a skill and there is that much of a demand, you're going to make some money doing it.
Absolutely. And so there was one particular day where he and a friend were walking to a music hall about to perform. And they walked past this building in which they heard a man with a belting voice commanding an audience in front of him. And they said there was this crazy man hallowing there, he says, and I believe in one of his biographies. And turns out that crazy man was Reverend George Whitefield. I mean, Reverend George Whitefield was known as one of the greatest preachers and pastors and ministers during the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening in America. He had preached over 18,000 sermons, rode across 13 colonies for 34 years. Approximately 80% of the American Republic heard that man preach in the open air. So very famous guy.
Right, so there's this huge crowd of people listening, and his friend said, bet you won't. And he was daring him to pick up his French horn and blow it to disturb everybody. And John Marrant says, yeah, okay, I'll do it. So he puts up his horn, and right before he starts to blow it, the Reverend George Whitefield turns and points at him and says, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel. And John Marrant just falls flat, stunned. Absolutely stunned. So after the sermon was preached, George Whitefield came over to him.
Well, let's unfold that for a second, because he falls flat, stunned, and it's not like he just gets up and it's okay. Yeah. Like, he's like paralysis.
No, I don't know if you've heard of the Holy Spirit, but like that's what happened.
I mean, like this dude couldn't move. Yes. And again, we're telling the abbreviated version because people try to pick him up and he's like falling down. So finally they're like, just leave him there. Afterwards, we'll deal with him. Afterwards, they take him back to the vestry room, right? And it's a room kind of back behind the pulpit area. And George Whitefield comes and he's like, looks like Jesus got a hold of you at last.
Yeah, and he says, I'm actually going to leave, but you should just go back to your house or something, and I'll send someone eventually. So a couple days later, a minister comes and sits by John Marrant's bed and holds his hand and starts praying over him. So he prays, and John Marrant feels terrible. And then he goes to pray again, and he feels even worse, and he feels like this guy's going to kill me.
And at this point, right, the pastor's like, hey, John, how do you feel? He's like, I feel terrible. Second time, how do you feel? Terrible. In fact, he's like, please stop praying for me because you're making me feel worse. And the pastor's like, no, then we have to pray harder.
Yeah. I feel like 3 is a good number when it comes to Christianity, so we're just going to push through on this one. So he prays again, and he felt well and happy.
Because he was so on fire, right?
So on fire.
Because he got knocked on the floor. He couldn't move, and then he was bad in prayer, and now he's good. And so he is so sold on this idea of Jesus and the Bible and Christianity. And that's where he's so passionate. All he wants to do is talk about Jesus and read his Bible and sing these Christian songs. And his family weren't really on the Jesus bandwagon yet. And they're like, dude, just shut up. Like, stop.
He said they called me every name except for that which was good.
So they called him lots of stuff except something polite or nice. And this is where, like, to jump ahead in the story, he realizes that life at home is not going to be great for a while. So he decides he's just going to go in the woods. He'll go find peace in the woods, and actually resolves that he's just going to go die in the wood because he'd rather just go meet Jesus, right? I'll die and meet Jesus. But when he goes to the woods, there was a Cherokee brave who was out gathering furs, was hunting, was fishing, and living off the wild. Well, this Cherokee brave had done trading in town, and he recognized this John Marrant, this 13-year-old kid at this time. And he's like, hey, man, what are you doing? And they start talking. John Marrant says, I have nowhere to go. And the Indian's like, well, let me help take care of you. So this Indian brave, this Cherokee, helps take care of John for really like the next 8 weeks or so.
Yeah. So they lived together in the woods for 8-10 weeks, and John Marrant starts to learn the Cherokee language. And the Cherokee brave or warrior says, hey, just come on back to my tribe. Everything's fine. So he goes back with him, and the chief says, okay, he's actually not Cherokee. I know this because he's black. So therefore, he's an enemy, because everyone who is not Cherokee is an enemy. So they put him in prison, in jail, right? And they're talking about ways that they are going to torture him.
Yeah, so John Marrant says as they determine they're going to execute him, they're walking him to where they're going to imprison him. They walked him by the place where he said the next morning they're going to kill him. And they begin to talk about how they were going to kill him. And not to be too graphic, but he said that they explained they were going to take his clothes off. They're going to stake him out naked. They were going to take these little pine needles and stick him in his back and light him on fire. And then if he was still alive, flip him over and do it on the other side. If he's still alive, they're going to put him on this stick and kind of like a spit over the fire. They're going to, like, just graphic. And it's a 13-year-old kid hearing that that's what's going to happen to him in the morning. You can imagine he's terrified. So they put him in this little kind of prison hut, locked from the outside. It's got a guard. Well, at first he said he was just kind of overwhelmed and terrified, but as he began to contemplate, he realized, well, when I die,
I get to meet Jesus. This is great.
This is great. So he begins to have like this Paul and Silas praise moment in the midst of being imprisoned, and it causes enough ruckus that the guard on the outside is like, something's not right.
Who are you talking to, bro?
Right. So literally, like, the guard opens the door and he's like, hey, who are you talking to? And John's like, I'm talking to Jesus.
Yeah, this guy's crazy. Okay.
The guard's looking around like, I don't see Jesus. And John's like, no, he's with us right now. And so the guard is like, okay, explain yourself. So John begins explaining Jesus. The guard is kind of impressed, like, okay, that's different. He says, wait a second, puts John back in, locks him up, but he goes and gets the elders of the tribe, brings the elders over, and he tells John, tell them what you told me about Jesus. And John has his Bible the whole time. So, right, you can imagine he's probably explaining, right, the great God, and he's revealed his truth, and it's about his son, and he's explaining this. Well, then the elders are like, well, we need to tell the chief. And so finally John gets before the chief. He explains Jesus. Well, he's supposed to be executed, but the chief decides, we're going to give you a pardon, and actually we're going to make you a prince of the tribe. They gave him this like lanyard that he wore around that gave him free pass anywhere in the tribes.
So actually, he lives with them for several weeks, mentoring them and teaching them about Jesus. And then the chief says, wait a minute. We need to spread this word of this guy named Jesus. So why don't I send you out with 50 of my braves, which is huge. That's like 50 Navy SEALs riding out with this 14-year-old boy.
John said it was the chief's personal guard.
Yeah.
Right? So these are like the best warriors. And the chief explained, I don't want to send you to these other tribes who they're going to see you as an outsider like we did. They're going to try to kill you like we did. They need to hear about Jesus. So if they see my warriors, the warriors will keep you safe. And I can only imagine, right? Like if someone came to you and they're like, hey, Elijah, so we want to recruit you to be a missionary. And it's going to be kind of dangerous, but the good news is there's 50 Navy SEALs, right? Force Recon Marines, Green Berets, like they're going to I don't even know where we're going, but I'm in, right? This is amazing, whatever's about to happen. This is literally what John Marrant does, and he goes from tribe to tribe to tribe, and approximately like the next half year to a year, he is going from village to village, helping evangelize these other native tribes, and ultimately the most successful that anybody had been with some of these tribes, but he's doing it as a 13, turned 14 years old boys out there. So as you can imagine, for a 13 or 14-year-old, he's kind of getting a little lonely, right? He's been gone over a year. He's like, I just want to see my family again. So finally he decides, it's time for me to leave. It's time for me to go back and see my family.
He realizes that as he's going home, that he's adopted a lot of the customs of the Native American people. He's wearing feathers in his hair. He has a loincloth. He doesn't have any of his modern contemporary clothes there with him. And his chest is completely painted in war colors that would have been there with Native American Indians, right? And so he gets home realizing that he doesn't look like anything from which the time he left. And so he knocks on the door. His mom answers the door and she doesn't recognize him at all. And he keeps trying to convince her, it's me, it's John. And she's like, nope, that's not, this isn't my son. My son wears clothes, you know, my son has propriety. And so eventually one of his little sisters runs around the house and says, no, I recognize him. That is John.
It's so crazy, right? But this is the reality, and there's so much more to his story. This is just kind of one of the parts that made him significant. This is the first black man to successfully evangelize Native Americans, and he did it when he was 13 and 14 years old. There's a lot more to his story, and really his story became one of the most famous narratives of any black American at that time. Incredibly well-selling narrative, which is something, if you want to find out more about that, you can go to WallBuilders.com. There's so much more to his story. You need to see the rest of it. But when we talk about the legacy of famous Americans or people that made a major difference in America, John Marrant's name is someone we should certainly talk about. To find out more, go to wallbuilders.com, and to learn more of some of these great heroes, just join in next time for One Room Schoolhouse.